This video will help you understand the difference between a revocable and an irrevocable trust. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. If you start Googling estate planning, it's not long before the sage advice of go set up a trust pops up on your screen. Now, you may or may not want to go set up a trust, but as you do your Googling, you're going to find things like trusts can avoid taxes. But then you'll also find things like trusts have their own tax rates, and those tax rates are pretty expensive, aka, confiscatory. You might also read things like trusts are really for the ultra wealthy, or, emotionally you might have a bad taste in your mouth because, you've known some trust fund kids that turned out to be total you-know-whats. You might also read things like this is a permanent decision. If you set up a trust, you can't change your mind, and that might be cause for concern. So in today's video, we'll break down 90% of what you need to know in differentiating these two types of trust between revocable and irrevocable. So let's jump in. Now, we're not going to get into whether or not you should go set up a trust. That'll be in the next video. This video is solely to establish a baseline to understand the difference between the two types of trusts. To keep it simple, if you're looking for a way to avoid probate, and that's your primary concern, then a revocable living trust will satisfy that objective 90% of the time. And probate, as a refresher, is simply the process where the courts decide who gets what assets that weren't provided an explicit beneficiary designation. On the other hand, if you want to completely remove an asset from your estate while you're alive, and you're okay with giving up permanent control of that to a third party, then you might look into setting up an irrevocable trust. And we'll touch on why that's important later on. First, let's touch on revocable living trust so you better understand the nuance there. So revocable living trust, simply defined, is a trust that you can make changes to while you're still alive, and you establish the trust while you're still living. This is in contrast to a testamentary trust, which you would establish via your last will and testament, and that trust would get established after you're gone. With the revocable living trust, you can terminate the trust, you can make changes to the description of maybe who gets what after you're gone, how the assets can be used, you can move assets inside or outside the trust, you have full discretion. Also, any income generated by property or assets inside that trust directly pass through to you as the trust owner. So there's no separate tax accounting you have to do with a revocable living trust. The primary purposes behind setting up a revocable living trust is to avoid probate, like we already talked about, but also to provide some privacy, and then third, to make sure that assets are properly accounted for as it pertains to estate taxes. So the first one, avoiding probate. That's important because depending on who needs these assets after you're gone, the probate process can be fast or slow. Now, the assets that generally go through probate are what are called probate assets. So these would be things like bank accounts, joint investment accounts, homes, aka financial resources that don't have an explicit beneficiary designation to them. This is in contrast to non-probate assets, which are assets that don't go through the courts because they have an explicit beneficiary designation. And these would be things like life insurance policies, retirement accounts, etc. Depending on how quickly your heirs or loved ones or whoever you're trying to pass these assets to after you're gone needs these resources, it might be pretty disadvantageous for them to wade through probate before they can access these resources. And that could be fodder for setting up a revocable living trust. It's not hard to imagine an example where, let's say, a mom and dad set up a joint investment account, but there's no beneficiary designation because joint investment accounts don't have beneficiary designations, and they pass away, and now the minor kiddos of the family don't have any financial resources. Maybe they're moving in with grandma and grandpa in this situation, but maybe grandma and grandpa don't have a ton of discretionary assets either. Unfortunately, the family has to wade through the process of probate, which can take a long time or a short time, before they can access the resources inside that joint investment account and help supplement income. In those cases, it's really easy to see how setting up a revocable living trust ahead of time and moving that joint investment account into the trust would lubricate the probate process and ensure that the kiddos get resources as quickly as possible. Quick disclaimer that your will does not avoid probate. So any assets in your will you designate to certain loved ones, while that's great and probably those folks will get those assets, it's not necessarily a guarantee. People can contest wills if they think you were not of sound mind or under duress of some kind. And again, all those assets still go through the probate process. The will simply tells the courts what you will to happen to your resources, and normally that stuff is followed, but again, it could be a while before the kiddos get the resources they need. The second benefit of a revocable living trust is privacy. So wills are a matter of public record. If you put in your will, here's the password to my Facebook account, that's a public record, and unfortunately, that's available for anybody to see. Whereas assets inside of a revocable living trust, when you pass away, those are not a matter of public record. Since they are non-probate, they immediately just transfer to the heirs that you've designated. They have a copy of the trust, and that's it. The last main popular benefit of setting up a revocable living trust is to ensure proper estate accounting. A third very common reason for setting up a revocable living trust is to ensure proper estate accounting upon the death of the first spouse. Now, as it pertains to whether things are titled as separately held or jointly held, whether you live in a common law state or community property state, those are all going to have nuanced implications relative to things like divorce. For the purposes of this, we're only talking about the tax treatment upon death. Generally, regardless of whichever state you live in, separately owned property, which is property that you accumulated before you got married or that you accumulated during marriage by way of a gift, inheritance, or like a life insurance settlement, that's going to all be considered separate property. Upon the death of the spouse that owns that separate property will receive a full step up in basis on the fair market value of that property, and then the surviving spouse will inherit that property at a full step up. So for example, let's say before I got married, I bought 100 grand of Amazon stock and now it's worth $1 million. When I die, my wife will receive a full $1 million stepped up in basis Amazon stock account. When it comes to jointly owned property or property that's deemed to be owned jointly, depending on whether you live in a common law state or a community property state, will dictate the tax benefits upon the death of the first spouse. We'll have to touch on the nuances between these two classifications another time, but to keep it very simple, generally, jointly held property in a common law state, which are most states, the surviving spouse will receive a partial step up in basis on the jointly held assets, whereas in a community property state, like Washington state, for example, the surviving spouse will receive a full step up in basis on any jointly held property. This is obviously a huge tax benefit, and it decreases the mortality risk or the concern of who's going to die first if you have the trust titled as the owner of these properties, and the trust is obviously a jointly held trust. Titling everything in the trust is a very easy way to indicate that your intentions are for this property to be treated as jointly held property and subsequently treated with certain tax benefits upon the death of the first spouse. Some states specifically have you refer to these as community property trusts, but you'll need to speak with an estate planning attorney in your state for the specific guidance here. Now, there are some other ways in which you can title jointly held property to achieve the same desired result, but a trust makes things simple, and with all those other benefits we mentioned, it makes it a pretty good argument that a revocable living trust has some pretty good advantages. Now let's touch on irrevocable trusts. I kind of think of irrevocable trusts as essentially creating a third person to fulfill your wishes, give money to, move money outside of your estate to them, but then unfortunately once you give it to them, you don't get it back. The main benefit of an irrevocable living trust is tax savings, and we'll touch on that in a second, as well as making gifts to loved ones while maintaining a certain level of dictate over how those assets are to be used. So first let's touch on why these can be helpful from a tax standpoint. If you're over the federal estate tax exemption, and in 2024, that's 13.6 million. If your net worth exceeds those numbers, then a irrevocable trust can make a lot of sense, because what you want to do with the trust is transfer assets out of your estate before you pass away. Because when you pass away, those assets are all going to be included inside your estate and then taxed appropriately from an estate tax standpoint. In addition, even if you're not at those levels, your state might have a specific state estate tax. Like in Washington state, 2.2 million is the Washington state estate tax exemption. If you have a net estate over 2.2 million upon your death, then you get to pay Washington state estate taxes. And it could totally make sense to transfer assets out of your estate before you reach those numbers. Now, any assets that you gift out of your estate before you pass away do have a dollar for dollar decrease in your federal lifetime gifting exclusion amount. What that means is, if I gift $1 million from my estate to an irrevocable trust, now when I die, as opposed to my exemption being 13.6 million, it's now 12.6 million for when I eventually pass away. So we really want to do this well ahead of reaching those federal estate tax exemption levels. But either way, even if we're well past those levels already, if you have assets that are most likely going to appreciate and be worth a lot more when you die, and you really don't want to keep those in your estate anymore because it just hurts you from an estate tax standpoint, it would totally make sense to look into transferring those assets out of your estate before you pass away, move that to an irrevocable trust, allow those assets to appreciate tremendously, because when you die, since you move those assets out of your estate, whatever they appreciated to does not hurt you from an estate tax standpoint. Now, I say hurt you from an estate tax standpoint. In reality, it really just hurts your heirs or the beneficiaries you want your property to go to, because any taxes you pay, by definition, just decreases the net estate that goes to your loved ones after Uncle Sam takes his piece. Now, I want to clarify on the federal level, there's a 3-year clawback, and what that means is if you transfer a bunch of property out of your estate and then you pass away within the next 3 years, those assets you transferred out get clawed back into your estate for federal estate tax purposes. This is not the case, however, with the Washington state estate tax. And I made a phone call specifically on this to confirm, theoretically, I could write all of my property out of my estate the day before I die in Washington state, and if my net estate is less than $2.2 million when I die, regardless of when I gifted all the property, I won't owe any Washington state estate taxes. So a little nuance and probably some research to do if your state has a state estate tax. Now let's touch on the second benefit of an irrevocable living trust. Because if you're under the federal estate tax exemptions or even the state estate tax exemptions, there's not really a huge tax benefit in setting up an irrevocable trust. However, there might be some benefit from a gifting standpoint to see your loved ones enjoy the property that you want them to have eventually, but still see them using it appropriately per your wishes. Let's say, for example, when you were in your 40s and 50s, you acquired a vacation property right next to a ski resort. And the family used that and they loved it and they went skiing and snowboarding and all sorts of snow sports. But now you're a grandparent, you're not really hitting the slopes as much anymore. But your grandkids and your nieces and nephews and their kids, they'd really love to enjoy that property. So maybe you look to transfer that vacation property into an irrevocable trust. You get it out of your estate, but again, that may or may not matter from a tax standpoint. You make all the kiddos beneficiaries of that trust, and you've outlined in the irrevocable trust how this vacation property is to be used, who can share it, maybe what some of the rules are, etc. Now, it's irrevocable, meaning you can't change your mind after you sign on the dotted line, barring some very unique circumstances. However, you can still dictate how the property is to be used within reason, and you get to see all the kiddos benefit from using that property you transferred to an irrevocable trust. You would do this because you want to have a little bit more control rather than just outright gifting them the deed to the property, and presumably giving them unfettered access to the property, and maybe not that meets the intent that you originally wanted this property to be used for. And so that's how it could work from a gifting standpoint, having a little bit of control of the property. Granted, you transfer it out of your estate, but you can still see loved ones enjoy and use the property. That could be grounds for an irrevocable trust. Some quick admin notes on irrevocable trusts. Number one, when the trust is created, it will have its own EIN, or basically social security number. And that also means it has to file its own tax return if it generates income. And those tax rates are pretty egregious. And I'll link those tax rates down below. Let's go back to our example of that vacation property. Let's say that it was set up as an Airbnb, and really only the kiddos use it every few months, and the other times it's a short-term rental and it's producing some income. And let's say rental income is around $2,000 a month. That would annualize to about $24,000, and barring any other deductions that you can take as a rental property, let's just keep it simple and say the trust generated $24,000 of income in this tax year. Now, once the trust reaches $15,200 for the tax year of 2024, anything above and beyond that is taxed at 37%. Anything below that is taxed at other rates, but it's not tax-free. And in 2026, these tax rates are most likely going to sunset, and we'll go back to essentially higher federal income tax brackets across the board. So to keep it very simple, my point here is that trust income is very expensive. So as long as you've factored in whether or not the trust is producing income and the tax ramifications to that make sense, it may or may not influence your decision as to whether or not you should transfer this property to an irrevocable trust. General guidance here is that if you're going to move money into an irrevocable trust for estate tax purposes, you're going to want to transfer property that is not really income producing, but is very appreciable. So for example, that'd be like concentrated stock. Maybe you forecast the stock is going to appreciate tremendously. You want to get it out of your estate ASAP, but the concentrated stock really isn't going to produce any income. So then the trust won't have to file a tax return and pay a bunch of trust tax rates. Okay, so calls to action wise, I would evaluate whether or not either one of these trusts is in your best interest now that you're equipped with understanding kind of the main differences between the two. I'm sure I missed a whole host of stuff, and I'm sure some estate planning attorneys are going to roast me in the comments, but generally in my practice, this is what I found is a very simplified way of understanding the difference. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below. Hopefully it's helpful. Have an awesome rest of your week. We'll talk to you later. Bye.